It was a fine morning, though one of those grey days that are typical in the English countryside. The estate of Lord Atwell lay still, its ivy-clad walls wrapped in silence, as the early spring air brought with it the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The narrow drive that led to the grand house was almost empty of life, save for a few distant figures labouring in the garden, their movements slow, deliberate, like the house itself. If I had not known the matter at hand, I might have mistaken it for a quiet, contented household, but as it was, the circumstances were far from tranquil. Lord Atwell, the head of the estate, had been found dead in his study, slumped at his desk with no visible signs of violence. A tragic but at first glance natural occurrence. Heart failure, perhaps. The coroner had agreed, ruling it an unfortunate end without further suspicion. It was only the peculiar detail of a letter left half open on his desk, its edge crinkled, that had roused the first murmur of curiosity among those who had discovered the body. The letter, though, seemed to bear no special significance, no important communication, merely a routine piece of correspondence, its ink fading in the early morning light. There was something unusual about it, however, which, I must confess, took me some time to grasp. A single fingerprint smudged across its surface, a mark that could have been entirely dismissed were it not for one simple detail. It was not Lord Atwell's. At this point, the investigation had become a matter of sheer confusion. The local constable, a good man but entirely out of his depth, had already begun to question the family and staff. However, there was little he could uncover, nothing, I dare say, but contradictions. The family had remained mostly tight-lipped. The servants had been far too eager to assist in every trivial way. I too would have been inclined to dismiss the case had I not received a letter from the Atwell family itself, asking for my assistance. "Mon ami," said Poirot, as we stood in the drawing-room of the Atwell estate, "the mind of the criminal is like a labyrinth, complicated, yes, but always with an end. I shall find the exit." His words were of no great reassurance, as they often are when Poirot speaks. His confidence, as usual, was almost unnerving, and it did not help that my own mind was full of uncertainty. It had been a long time since I had encountered such a case, and for once I felt the weight of the mystery press down upon me. The strange imprint on the letter gnawed at me, a nagging detail that refused to leave my thoughts. Poirot had insisted on examining the study at once, which, naturally, meant I was forced to follow him. His steps, as ever, were deliberate and precise, much like the rest of him. He was immaculate as always, his dark suit sharply cut, his gloves spotless, his bow tie perfectly centered beneath his chin. His hair, though thinning, was combed back with such care that it seemed each strand had been placed there by the hand of a craftsman. "I do not like disorder, Hastings," Poirot remarked, as he adjusted a picture frame on the desk of Lord Atwell's study. "Not in my work, and certainly not in the minds of those who commit these heinous acts. Disorder is a sign, yes, but it is also a tool. We must beware of it." I, for my part, could not yet see how disorder might be at the heart of the puzzle. I had only begun to see the faintest outline of a solution. Still, I knew Poirot better than to doubt his instincts. "The fingerprint, Poirot," I said, trying to keep my thoughts on the matter at hand. "It seems out of place. If the death was natural, why would someone have touched the letter at all, and why leave such a conspicuous mark?" Poirot turned to me, his eyes narrowing in that way that only he can manage. "Mon ami, the answer is clear. It is a clue, of course, but what does it tell us? That Lord Atwell was not alone in his final moments, that another hand was involved." He smiled slightly, his lips curling at the edges. "But who?" "Ah, that is the question, Hastings." I glanced at the desk, noting the smudge again, a mark like the trail of a shadow cast where none should have been. Poirot, still focused on the letter, leaned in closer, studying the edges of the paper. His fingers hovered above the ink, but he did not touch it. There was something deliberate in his restraint. "Observe, Hastings," he said quietly. "This is no casual touch. The hand that left this mark was deliberate, careful, and the mark itself, it is too neat, as though it were made to be noticed." He straightened up, stepping back from the desk. "A plant, mon ami, a piece of misdirection. Whoever placed that fingerprint intended for us to find it." I felt a chill run down my spine. The idea of misdirection was as unsettling as it was brilliant. The more Poirot spoke, the more it seemed that Lord Atwell's death was not as straightforward as it appeared, but there were still too many uncertainties. "And what of the rest of the room?" I asked. "Nothing seems disturbed. Nothing appears out of place." Poirot's eyes flicked over the room, a quick scan, as though his mind were already piecing together the puzzle. "The absence of disorder is itself a clue, Hastings. If a man were to die in his study, a man who was expecting no harm, would he not, in his final moments, have left some trace of his distress, perhaps a fallen object, a knocked-over chair?" He gestured vaguely around the room. "But nothing. This is too orderly, even for a man who takes care with his things. The death was planned, perhaps, and the location chosen." At that moment, a soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation. The butler, Mr. Pender, entered, his expression as tight and impassive as ever. He looked as though he had been waiting for this moment, though I could not quite fathom why. "Sir," he said, his voice low, "the local constable would like to speak with you." Poirot nodded and turned toward me with that characteristic gleam in his eye. "And so, Hastings, the investigation deepens. We must not allow ourselves to be blinded by what is apparent. The truth is always deeper, if one has the courage to search for it." As we left the study and made our way to the drawing-room, my mind swirled with the contradictions Poirot had already uncovered. There was something decidedly wrong about Lord Atwell's death, something far more sinister than a mere accident. The fingerprint, the unnatural stillness of the room, the way the death had been handled, all of it pointed to one undeniable fact. Whoever had been involved in Lord Atwell's demise had planned it with great care. And as Poirot settled into the chair, his mind already turning over the clues, I couldn't help but feel that the more we uncovered, the more tangled the web would become. It was a puzzle, yes, but one that would take all of Poirot's little grey cells to solve. We arrived at the Atwell estate late in the afternoon, the long shadows of the evening stretching across the sprawling grounds as we made our way up the gravel drive. Poirot, as always, was immaculate, his crisp, tailored suit as precise as the rhythm of his steps. There was no sign of the flurry, of activity that had marked the earlier moments of our visit, no servants bustling about in the corridors or drawing-room. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. But Poirot, though he spoke little, seemed already to have absorbed the weight of the place, his mind undoubtedly forming its first conclusions. "It is not the house that holds the mystery, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice calm, "but the people within it." I glanced around, not entirely sure what he meant, but not daring to challenge him. There was something about the way he spoke that made even the most innocuous comment feel like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. As we entered the drawing-room, I was struck by the atmosphere, a blend of old wealth, stillness, and suppressed tension. Lady Evelyn, Lord Atwell's widow, was seated by the window, a faint look of worry on her pale face. Her mourning attire was immaculate, yet there was an unease in her movements that hinted at something deeper. She had not yet spoken, though her eyes darted nervously between Poirot and myself as we entered. Charles Atwell, the heir to the estate, was a study in aloofness. He was standing by the fireplace, arms crossed over his chest, eyes gazing toward the hearth as though lost in some private thought. His posture was rigid, his jaw set in a manner that suggested a man either too proud or too afraid to show emotion. It struck me as odd that he had not made any attempt to acknowledge his mother's grief or the presence of the investigator. But then again, perhaps that was simply his way. The elderly butler, Mr. Pender, stood by the door watching us with a strange, unreadable expression. His gaze flicked between Poirot and the rest of the family, his silence more oppressive than any words. And then there was the young maid, Miss Trask, who fidgeted near the back of the room. She appeared quite out of place, her youth and nervous energy standing in stark contrast to the more restrained demeanor of the others. Poirot took a moment to survey the room before speaking, his voice soft, but cutting through the air like a blade. "Ah, but there is tension in this room, Hastings, you see. It is palpable." His words were so precise, so sharp, that I could not help but be drawn into his analysis. He continued, "Lady Evelyn, you appear most composed, but your hands, they are trembling slightly. Why?" Lady Evelyn blinked, clearly startled by the observation. For a moment, her composure faltered, just enough for Poirot to notice before she swiftly recovered. I am merely distraught," she replied, her voice fluttering slightly as she spoke. Poirot nodded, as if granting her the benefit of the doubt, but I could sense his skepticism. He had already begun to form a judgment of her, and it was clear that he was not convinced by her words. Turning his gaze on Charles, Poirot's lips curled into a slight smile, the kind that I knew meant he had already seen something others might miss. "Monsieur Atwell," Poirot said, his voice soft but unmistakably direct. "You are quiet. Too quiet, yes? Not a word of regret, not even a murmur of sorrow. Tell me, is it that you are consumed by grief, or by something else?" Charles stiffened visibly, his eyes flashing toward Poirot for a fraction of a second before returning to the fire. He said nothing. Poirot made no further comment, but seemed satisfied with his observation. His gaze shifted then to Mr. Pender, the butler, who had thus far remained motionless. The old man's face was stoic, but his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched ever so slightly, gave him an air of fatigue or strain. "And you, Pender," Poirot said, his voice now almost conspiratorial. "You who have been in this house for so many years, you seem the very embodiment of loyalty. But loyalty, mon ami, can be a shield for many things. Perhaps there is something you wish to hide." Mr. Pender's eyes flicked to Poirot and then away, but he said nothing. That brief exchange was enough for Poirot, who then turned toward Miss Trask, the young maid who had been standing quietly at the back of the room. "You, Miss Trask, you look quite agitated. Your hands are clenched, yes, as if you wish to hold something back. Tell me, did you see anything unusual last night?" Her breath hitched slightly, and I saw her glance quickly toward Lady Evelyn, who stiffened, a slight frown appearing on her face. But Miss Trask quickly averted her gaze and shook her head. "No, sir, nothing unusual." Poirot did not press her further. Instead, he seemed to take in the room as a whole, his gaze sweeping over every person, every detail, his mind working in ways that none of us could fully grasp. "I believe, Hastings," Poirot said after a long silence, "that there is more here than meets the eye. These people," he gestured subtly, "they all have something to hide. And yet it is not the hiding that concerns me. No, what concerns me is that they are hiding the wrong thing." I was about to ask him to elaborate when his eyes suddenly fixed on something across the room. Without a word, he walked to the far corner of the room, where a vase sat upon a windowsill, the light from the fading sun casting long shadows across the polished surface. The vase had been moved. I could not say how I knew it, but there was something about the arrangement of flowers that seemed off. The position of the vase was too far forward, as though it had been hastily placed there. Poirot's finger traced the edge of the windowsill, and when he turned back to the group, his expression had shifted, just slightly, into something more thoughtful. "There," he said softly, his voice a low hum in the quiet room. "That vase. It was moved, Hastings. Not in haste, but with a certain deliberation. A small action, yes, but one that speaks volumes." I was still trying to grasp the significance of it when Poirot continued, his gaze now sweeping back over the family. "Who moved it, I wonder? And why?" I felt a shiver run through me. The simple act of shifting a vase could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. And as Poirot's gaze lingered on the assembled suspects, I had the unsettling sense that the answers we were seeking were already beginning to take shape, hidden beneath the surface of every glance and every word. The room fell into silence, as Poirot turned away from the vase and made his way toward the door. "I believe, Hastings," he said, pausing just before leaving, "we shall need to speak to the staff. Perhaps they will reveal more than they realize. But first, we shall see if there is more to this vase than it appears." I could only nod, knowing that, as always, Poirot had already seen far more than I ever could. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, and yet I could not help but feel that the deeper we delved, the more complex the mystery would become. The morning after our initial investigation, Poirot and I were back in the drawing room, preparing to begin the interviews with the family and staff. Poirot, ever meticulous, had made no comment on our observations from the previous evening. He merely took a seat in one of the leather armchairs and began the careful process of sorting through his thoughts, his fingers delicately tapping on the armrest. I, in contrast, was still grappling with the enormity of the situation. The death of Lord Atwell seemed so untidy, as if the house and its inhabitants were all connected by invisible threads, each ready to snap at any moment. But Poirot, of course, was already several steps ahead, his mind whirring with the possibilities of what we might uncover. "It is time, Hastings," Poirot said at last, looking up with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We shall begin with Lady Evelyn. She has much to tell us, I believe." Lady Evelyn entered the room with the grace of a woman who had lived a life of privilege. Her eyes were red from too many hours of grief, and yet she held herself with a certain hauteur, as if unwilling to let the weight of her mourning entirely overtake her composure. She sat down across from us, hands folded in her lap, and regarded us with a polite, if distant, smile. "I trust you have found everything in order, Mr. Poirot?" she asked, her voice soft but controlled. Poirot gave her a smile that I knew was calculated to put her at ease, though I could sense his sharp eyes probing beneath her calm facade. "I have found, madame, that this is a most intriguing house." "Most intriguing indeed," Poirot replied. "But perhaps you will enlighten me about your whereabouts last night." Lady Evelyn blinked at him for a moment, her face faltering just slightly, though she quickly regained her composure. "I was in my private quarters," she said, her voice steady. "I was in no mood to be disturbed, especially after the shock of finding my husband." Her hands, I noticed, were perfectly still, but there was a slight tremor in her voice that didn't quite match the calm of her outward appearance. Poirot did not miss it, and though he said nothing immediately, I could see his mind working. "You are certain you were not disturbed?" Poirot pressed. "No one came to speak with you during the night? No sounds from the hallways?" "No," she said with a certainty that did not ring true. "I did not hear anything. I remained alone, and I went to bed early." I could see Poirot watching her closely, but he said nothing more, simply nodding his head in acknowledgement, before turning to me, his expression unreadable. He did not ask further questions, but something in the way she answered, that brief hesitation, that slight quiver, did not sit well with him. When Lady Evelyn left, Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling under his chin. I had to ask, even though I could already sense the answer. "Well, Poirot, what do you make of it?" I said, eager to know his thoughts. Poirot's eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite identify. "She has rehearsed her story, Hastings, carefully, deliberately, and yet there is an inconsistency in her words. You see, she tells me she was in her private quarters all night, yet she fails to mention anything about the sound of the house settling, the wind, the creaking of the floorboards. These small details, they are always the most revealing. I had not noticed this myself, but then again, I wasn't the one with Poirot's little grey cells. Still, I was not convinced that Lady Evelyn was anything other than a grieving. "A widow? I don't know, Poirot," I said, leaning forward. "She seems so sincere to me. Surely she wouldn't lie about something as simple as her whereabouts." Poirot smiled a little, though there was no warmth in it. "Ah, Hastings, that is where you are mistaken. The truth is rarely simple, and the lies we tell ourselves are often the most convincing." Before I could respond, the door opened and Charles Atwell stepped into the room, his face grim but composed. He was the epitome of stoic restraint, though his eyes betrayed a glimmer of something else, unease perhaps, or frustration. I had noticed it earlier, of course, but Poirot had picked up on it immediately. "Good morning, gentlemen," Charles said, though his greeting was somewhat perfunctory. "I trust you are making progress." Poirot nodded politely but said nothing, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably between them. "Mr. Atwell," Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet, "tell me, if you will, where you were last night." "I was in my study," Charles replied quickly without hesitation. "I was working late, catching up on some matters that had been left undone." "And no one disturbed you?" Poirot asked, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "No," Charles said a little too quickly. "I didn't want to be disturbed, not after everything." I noticed the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he spoke, the knuckles going white as he clenched them by his sides. It was a subtle sign, but Poirot did not miss it. I too felt a shift in the air. Something was off about Charles, something that didn't align with his words. Poirot's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he spoke again. "And you did not hear anything unusual, Monsieur Atwell?" "No. Sounds from the hallway, the house settling, any disturbance?" "No," Charles replied, though this time his voice was less sure. There was a tremor in it now, an undercurrent of uncertainty. His gaze flickered toward the door, and then quickly, back to Poirot. Poirot nodded slowly, but he did not press further. Instead, he glanced at me, as if to indicate that this interview had ended, at least for the moment. As Charles left the room, Poirot seemed to pause for a long moment, considering something. "There is something in the way he reacts, Hastings," Poirot murmured. "The trembling hands, the way he avoids direct eye contact. A man who is hiding something, perhaps more than he realizes." I was still turning over his words when the door opened once more, and Alice Trask, the young maid, entered, her eyes wide with nervousness. She was not quite as composed as the others, but there was an eagerness about her, an eagerness to please. That struck me as unnatural. "Miss Trask," Poirot said, gesturing for her to sit. "You were with Lord Atwell's widow last night, yes? What did you observe?" She seemed to hesitate for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't see anything, sir. Nothing unusual." "But you were in the house?" Poirot pressed. "Yes, sir," she answered quickly, nodding vigorously. "I was helping Lady Evelyn with some things. Nothing important." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You are sure, Miss Trask? Nothing out of the ordinary?" "No, nothing." "Sir," she repeated, her voice a little too eager, a little too sharp. There was something in the way she said it that set off a small alarm in my mind. I didn't trust her. Poirot rose from his chair with a slight sigh, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, Miss Trask," he said, though I could tell he was not satisfied with her answers. As she left, Poirot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "There is something there, Hastings, a nervous energy in that girl. She wishes to please, yes, but at what cost?" I had no answer, though I could not shake the feeling that we were not getting the full truth from any of them. The interviews were far from over, and yet already I felt the pull of contradictions, lies woven into the fabric of the truth. Something was amiss, and Poirot was slowly, meticulously, pulling at the threads. I had no idea where this would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. We had only begun to uncover the secrets of the Atwell estate, and I had no doubt that we would find more lies to unravel before the end. The morning sun shone weakly through the thick curtains of the drawing-room as Poirot, having spent the better part of an hour in contemplation, turned his attention back to the letter that had sparked his interest the night before. I had been mulling over our recent interviews, but Poirot's mind was clearly elsewhere, his gaze fixed on the small piece of correspondence he had set aside on the table earlier. It was the letter that had been found in Lord Atwell's study, the one bearing the mysterious smudge of a fingerprint that didn't belong to the deceased. We had already discussed the significance of the letter briefly, but Poirot's fascination with it had only deepened. I had to admit, I hadn't yet given it much thought beyond its obvious importance in the case, but Poirot was different. His eyes flickered to the letter again, and I saw the familiar gleam in them, one that meant he had noticed something new, something more than I could yet see. He reached for the letter carefully, as though it were an artifact from a delicate, fragile moment. He turned it over once, then again, examining it from every angle. He muttered something under his breath, in French, words I did not catch, and I knew that a conclusion was forming in his mind. "Do you not find it curious, Hastings?" Poirot asked suddenly, his voice low and controlled. "Curious?" I echoed, leaning forward. "I thought it was clear enough. The fingerprint doesn't belong to Lord Atwell, which could mean someone else was there. But it doesn't change much. A simple mistake, perhaps." Poirot smiled, a touch of condescension in the curve of his lips, though it wasn't meant unkindly. "Ah, but it is not so simple as that. The fingerprint, look at it, Hastings. It is not the mark of an accidental touch. No, this is a fingerprint that has been placed with great care, with deliberate intention." I studied the letter more closely now, my eyes narrowing as I noticed what Poirot meant. The smudge was not a hurried, haphazard print left by someone who had brushed against the paper in passing. No, this was a well-placed smudge, as if the person had held the paper for a moment too long, perhaps even gripping it carefully before letting go. And that was the thing. It didn't look like a mistake at all. The position of the letter itself is strange as well, Poirot continued. It is as though someone wanted it to be found, placed in the open for eyes to fall upon it, to be noticed. But that fingerprint, it was meant to mislead us, to make us think it was a careless touch. I felt a shiver run down my spine at the implications of his words. I had thought this clue trivial, but Poirot's sharp deduction painted it in a different light entirely. So someone wanted us to think it was a mistake, but it wasn't. Poirot's expression remained calm, though I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the connections forming. Exactly, mon ami. The letter was not simply discarded or left carelessly. It was intended to attract attention. But the fingerprint, it is the key, I believe. And the contents of the letter, I asked, still not understanding. Could there be something more there? Poirot took the letter in both hands, studying it one final time before answering. No, the contents are not so important. Not yet. What matters is that it was handled in a way that speaks of someone with purpose, someone with knowledge of the house, of the family. I could feel the tension building, the weight of the mystery pressing in on me. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed to fit together quite as neatly as Poirot's observations. Still, the question lingered. Why would someone have gone to such lengths to plant this false clue? And why was this particular letter singled out? Poirot did not let me linger on the question for long. He replaced the letter in its envelope, carefully sealing it once more. "We must consider," he said softly, "the people who had access to Lord Atwell's study and the places where he kept his most private papers. That is where we must begin." I felt a sense of frustration rise within me. Poirot's mind worked in ways I could never hope to understand, but I longed for him to reveal more of his reasoning. It was clear he was closer to something. But what? I glanced at him, awaiting the next step in his investigation, when he suddenly turned toward me with a look that was almost cryptic. "The answer, mon ami," Poirot murmured, "is in the details." I stared at him, confused. "The details?" "Yes, Hastings. The details. Always it is the smallest things that escape notice, the places where the mind does not wander." He placed the letter back on the table, his fingers brushing lightly over it once more before he turned to me. "Do you recall the vase on the windowsill?" I blinked, trying to recall the room. "The vase? The one that had been moved?" Poirot nodded sharply. "Exactly. The vase, though seemingly insignificant, has a role to play in this puzzle." "It was out of place, yes. Moved by whom, I wonder?" "The answer lies there in that seemingly simple act." I thought back to the study, to the room where Lord Atwell's body had been found. I recalled the vase, sitting by the windowsill. Its position changed, though at the time I had assumed it was nothing more than an accident. Now, however, I began to question whether it had been moved by someone with a far more deliberate intent. Poirot stood up then, his eyes flicking toward the door. "Let us take another look at the study, Hastings. The details will guide us further. A mind that does not see them will never understand the truth. But he paused for emphasis. "I have seen enough." I felt a sudden rush of excitement. Could it be that Poirot had already solved the puzzle in his mind? Was the answer really that simple? The notion seemed impossible, yet I could not shake the certainty that Poirot's next steps would reveal something that would shatter the case wide open. I followed him silently as he moved toward the door, his every step a study in determination and calm. I knew there was no room for hesitation now. We were close, closer than ever before. But what had the moving of that vase meant? And how would it connect to the carefully placed fingerprint on the letter? I felt my curiosity heighten, but Poirot's silence only deepened the mystery. The answer I knew was within reach, but only if I could see the details with the clarity that Poirot did. The morning after our latest examination of the study, Poirot remained unusually quiet, his thoughts seemingly preoccupied with the letter and the misplaced vase. He had taken to pacing the room, examining each new thought as though it were a delicate puzzle piece that needed to fit precisely into the whole. I had no doubt that Poirot was closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but there was an underlying tension in the air, a quiet sense of unease that hung over him. We were now to conduct the second round of interviews, and Poirot's manner had grown more focused, as though he were trying to unearth something buried deeper beneath the polished surfaces of the Atwell family's lives. The day before, Lady Evelyn's mannerisms had raised Poirot's suspicions, and Charles, the heir, had made little effort to conceal his unease. Now we would dig deeper, perhaps find a key to unlock the final piece of this puzzle. I had always admired Poirot's subtlety during interviews. He would never press a subject too hard, never make a person feel cornered, but his questions would always find their mark, like arrows hitting their target when the archer least expected it. This was why I knew it was only a matter of time before we uncovered the skeletons that this family so carefully kept hidden. We began with Lady Evelyn. She greeted us with a strained but polite smile, her face pale as she took her seat opposite Poirot. She had been unshakable in our first round of questioning, her alibi seemingly airtight, but something in her eyes told me that beneath her composed exterior, there was a woman whose nerves were being slowly frayed by the weight of the investigation. Poirot wasted no time. "Madame, you have spoken of your sorrow for the death of your husband, and we know of your devotion to him, but I must ask, do you perhaps know of any matters that may have troubled your husband in the days leading up to his death?" Her expression flickered for only a fraction of a second, but Poirot saw it. She was careful in her response. "Lord Atwell had his usual concerns, Mr. Poirot. Nothing out of the ordinary. We lived a quiet life, mostly." "Ah, mais non, madame. There is always something more beneath the surface. You see, I know that Lord Atwell had other concerns. Affairs of the heart, perhaps." Lady Evelyn's gaze hardened, but only for an instant. Then she sighed, her voice lower. "It's no secret, I suppose. I had a relationship with an artist many years ago, but that is in the past. We were young, and those things are better left behind." Poirot's eyes gleamed. This was the clue he had been waiting for. Another crack. In the family's perfect facade. "An artist, you say? Might I ask who he was, madame? The name, perhaps?" For a long moment she hesitated, the memory of her past clearly resurfacing in her mind. Then, almost reluctantly, she spoke. "His name was Victor Leclerc. He was well known at the time, an artist of some repute. But it was a long time ago." "Mr. Poirot, it hardly seems relevant." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "And yet, madame, it is always the past that holds the key, is it not?" She looked away, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I suppose you could say that. But I don't see how it has anything to do with my husband's death. That affair ended years ago." I could sense Poirot's mind already working, picking apart her words. The mention of an artist, an affair with someone of prominence, was a detail that couldn't be ignored. Yet Lady Evelyn's cool demeanor suggested that there was something more beneath the surface, something she was not revealing. Before I could voice my thoughts, Poirot shifted his attention. "Very well, madame. Let us leave that for now. But tell me this. Was there anyone in the household who might have had reason to harm your husband?" Lady Evelyn's hands tightened around her teacup, her fingers pale against the porcelain. "I don't believe anyone would have wanted to hurt him. We had our disagreements, of course, but nothing that would have led to something so terrible." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but I saw the look of doubt in his eyes. His mind had already latched onto something in Lady Evelyn's tone, something that didn't quite add up. We moved on to Charles next, the heir to the Atwell estate. He was as composed as ever, though the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of a sleepless night. His posture was stiff, and he avoided making direct eye contact with us as we sat down to question him. Poirot's first question was simple. "Monsieur Charles, you were in the house at the time of your father's death, yes?" Charles nodded, his voice calm. "Yes, I was in my room reading." "And yet you were seen leaving the study just before Lord Atwell's death," Poirot pressed, his gaze narrowing slightly. Charles stiffened. "I went to check on him, yes. He'd been unwell. But I assure you, I had no part in what happened to him." I noticed the subtle tremor in Charles's hands as he spoke, the slight quiver of his fingers when he reached for his drink. Poirot must have noticed it too, for his next question was phrased with deliberate slowness. "Monsieur Charles, might I ask if there were any recent financial difficulties?" Charles stiffened again, his face flushing. What do you mean? Of course, there were some challenges, but that's nothing new in a family of our size." Poirot's tone remained calm. "But surely, Monsieur Charles, you must know that such matters can lead to tension, no?" I saw Charles's jaw tighten, his eyes darting to the floor. "I had no such tension with my father. We disagreed, yes, but that was all." Poirot said nothing for a moment, simply watching him closely. I could see that Poirot's suspicions were growing. Financial strain, emotional strain. It was beginning to feel as though everyone in the house had a motive, a reason to lash out. Lastly, we spoke to Alice, the young maid. She had been nervously avoiding our gaze throughout the day, her hands fidgeting in her lap. When Poirot asked her about her whereabouts on the night of Lord Atwell's death, she stammered, then lowered her voice. I had an argument with Lord Atwell just days before he died," she said, barely above a whisper. He said I wasn't worth the wages I was asking for, that I should be grateful for what I was paid." Poirot's brow furrowed. "An argument over wages?" "Yes," Alice replied, a flush creeping up her neck. "It was a small thing, but it upset me. I never meant to say anything, but now, with him dead, I feel terrible." There was something in Alice's voice, fear, perhaps guilt, that made Poirot pause. It was clear she hadn't been involved directly in Lord Atwell's death, but I could not shake the feeling that she knew something. And then there was the matter of her relationship with the others in the household. Was there a deeper resentment, brewing beneath her timid exterior? As we left Alice to her thoughts, Poirot turned to me, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, Hastings, the tangled web grows more complex. Lady Evelyn's affair, Charles's debts, Alice's quarrel over wages, it is all so interwoven. But the question remains, which of these secrets is most dangerous?" I couldn't help but feel a tightening in my chest. We were uncovering the dark past of a family, and each new revelation only seemed to add to the web of suspicion. The puzzle was no closer to being solved, but I could sense the answer was near, lurking in the shadows of these hidden resentments. Poirot's eyes glinted. "Patience, mon ami. We are getting closer. I'm sure of it. But let us not forget, the truth is always the hardest to uncover when it's been buried for so long." As we moved on to the next suspect, I had to wonder, what more would we learn, and which of the Atwell's secrets would prove to be the key? The days following our second round of interviews were fraught with a palpable tension, the air thick with unspoken truths that seemed to cling to every corner of the Atwell estate. Poirot, as ever, remained a study in composure. He observed, reflected, and remained eerily calm, his mind perpetually sifting through the chaos of conflicting emotions and half-truths. I, on the other hand, found myself increasingly unnerved by the behavior of those around us. It was in the middle of one such day, as we walked through the grounds, that Poirot made a curious remark. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at Alice, the young maid, who was hurriedly carrying a basket of laundry toward the back entrance. She had always seemed overly eager to please, her soft voice and nervous fidgeting betraying the weight of something heavy on her shoulders. But on this particular afternoon, Poirot's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual. "She is hiding something," he murmured, his voice low but sharp. I turned to look at him. "You think she had something to do with it?" Poirot's eyes flickered briefly to Alice, before turning back to me. "I do not know yet, mon ami, but there is something about her that does not sit right. A secret, perhaps." I wanted to dismiss his words. After all, Alice had seemed so harmless. But Poirot's instincts were seldom wrong. A sense of unease began to gnaw at me, much as it had with Charles the day before. The young maid had been so quick to deny any involvement, so eager to appear innocent, and yet I had noticed the slight hesitation in her voice when we questioned her about Lord Atwell's final moments. Was it possible that beneath the surface of her timidity there was more? Poirot's observations only grew more pointed as the hours passed. The mysterious man who had visited the estate, a tall, dark figure whom no one seemed to know, had caused ripples among the household staff. Alice, when asked about him, had been quick to deny any knowledge, but Poirot had caught her looking at the door long after the visitor had left, her expression oddly guarded. That same evening, I had the chance to speak with her alone, under the pretense of checking on her well-being after our previous questioning. As I approached her, she was in the kitchen, her hands busy with a tray of teacups, her back turned to me. I noted the way she stiffened when I entered, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Alice," I said softly, taking a seat nearby. "You seemed upset when we spoke earlier." Her smile faltered. "Oh no, Mr. Hastings. I'm just tired is all." I couldn't help but notice how her eyes flicked toward the door once more, as though expecting someone. "I understand, but you know there's no need to be nervous. We're only trying to understand what happened to Lord Atwell." She nodded quickly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. "Of course, I'll do whatever I can to help, but I don't know anything more than I've told you." I smiled reassuringly, but I had learned enough over the years to recognize a lie when I heard one. "Is that so? There's nothing you've left out? Nothing at all?" Alice shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering toward the door once again. "Nothing," but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something more than she was willing to admit. As the evening wore on, I shared my growing suspicions with Poirot, who, as usual, remained calm and focused. He had observed Alice's behavior as well, but he was more concerned with the strange visitor who had come to the estate earlier in the day. Poirot had a knack for reading people, and he had detected a slight, almost imperceptible shift in Alice's demeanor when the man had left. "She knows him," Poirot said quietly. "The way she looked at him, Hastings, it was a look of recognition, not indifference. But why would she deny it?" We spent the next few days quietly watching Alice, and Poirot's suspicions seemed to be growing with each passing hour. But there were other matters to consider as well. Charles had been behaving erratically, and his increasingly volatile moods were becoming harder to ignore. It started with a casual remark during one of our conversations in the drawing room. Charles, always eager to appear in control, had been speaking of his father's legacy, his future responsibilities, and the financial matters he would soon inherit. But then, as if something had snapped inside him, his voice suddenly dropped and his tone became sharp. "Do you think I don't know what people are saying?" he snapped, staring at the floor. "That I've squandered my inheritance, that I'm drowning in debt." I exchanged a look with Poirot, who was watching Charles carefully, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Charles," I said gently, "that's not what we—" "Don't lie to me," he hissed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think it's all so simple, don't you? Just a matter of finding a murderer and pinning it on the first person you meet. Well, you don't know anything about the pressures I've been under, the choices I've had to make." I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him, but Poirot, ever the observer, was less moved by his outburst. "It is not your debts, Charles, that interest us," he said coolly, "but your state of mind, your actions in the days leading up to your father's death." Charles visibly flinched, his expression contorting with frustration. "I had nothing to do with it. Poirot, nothing at all. I was with Lady Evelyn the entire time." Poirot's response was measured. "But was she with you the entire time, Monsieur Charles?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Charles's face reddened and he quickly excused himself, the tension in the room palpable. I looked at Poirot, but he said nothing. His eyes were distant, focused on something only he could see. "His nerves are fraying," Poirot remarked after a long silence. "The pressure of financial ruin, perhaps, or the fear of losing everything. But what does it have to do with the murder of his father?" I glanced toward the door, where Lady Evelyn had been listening from the hallway, her face a mask of discomfort. The cracks in the family's facade were widening. Their secrets, once carefully guarded, were beginning to spill over. The emotional strain between mother and son was becoming impossible to ignore, and every passing day seemed to escalate the tension. Poirot did not let the silence linger long. "You see, Hastings," he said, "there are many emotions in play here. Fear, guilt, pride, and perhaps some jealousy." I was still uncertain, still unwilling to believe that Charles, whom I had once thought of as a victim in this tangled web, could be involved. But the evidence, his outbursts, his mounting financial troubles, pointed to something darker. As we continued to gather information, the lines between truth and misdirection began to blur. Poirot had a way of observing, of drawing out truths with a quiet, relentless precision. And as we moved forward, I could see the pressure mounting within the family, each new revelation, each new accusation, pushing them closer to breaking the eye. The stage was set for something dramatic, and I couldn't help but feel that the web Poirot had begun to weave was finally drawing tighter. But who, I wondered, was the fly in this web? Who would be the first to break under the strain? And when they did, would Poirot's observations prove to be the key to unlocking the truth? I was starting to fear that the answer was not as simple as I had once believed. The atmosphere in the Atwell household had grown heavier by the day, the weight of suspicion and guilt pressing on each of us in turn. I had begun to question everything, not only about the case but also about the people who surrounded me. Lady Evelyn, Charles, Alice, even the quiet servants, they all held their secrets, and Poirot seemed to be peeling back layer after layer. I, for my part, felt as though I were following in his wake, bewildered by the complex web he was weaving. The breakthrough came one morning when Poirot beckoned me into his study with a look that was unusually intense, even for him. I had been reviewing my notes when he placed a letter before me, a letter with the same distinctive fingerprint we had seen earlier on the paper found in Lord Atwell's study. His fingers traced the edge of the page with an almost reverential air. "Hastings, I have discovered something most interesting," he began, his voice clipped with excitement. "You recall the mysterious man seen with Alice, the one she denied knowing, the one I observed her so intently watching as he left the estate?" I nodded. Alice's behavior had struck me as odd, but Poirot's suspicions seemed to have been correct. She was hiding something, and now Poirot was about to reveal another piece of the puzzle. "That man, mon ami, is no stranger to the Atwell family," Poirot continued. "His true identity, however, has been carefully concealed. He is none other than Lucien Devereux, an artist of some renown in the past, but now a man with a new name, a new life." I sat back, taken aback by the revelation. Lucien Devereux. The name stirred something in my memory, but it wasn't until Poirot spoke again that the full weight of the discovery struck me. Lady Evelyn was once involved with him. A passionate affair, as it were, years ago. But more than that, Hastings, Devereux had been in a financial dispute with Lord Atwell, a dispute that, I believe, may hold the key to understanding the murder. I felt the ground beneath me shift. What began as a vague suspicion had now turned into a substantial lead. But how did this connection tie in with the murder? I turned to Poirot, eager for his insight. "Poirot, are you suggesting that Devereux had a direct role in Lord Atwell's death? That this artist, who once loved Lady Evelyn, was somehow involved?" Poirot did not answer immediately, his eyes scanning the letter in front of him. "Not directly, perhaps, but I am certain that Devereux's presence here is no coincidence. And there is more. When I spoke to the household staff, I found that he had visited the estate under an assumed name. He is no longer the artist, Hastings. He is a man desperate to hide his past." My mind reeled as I tried to piece together this new revelation. If Devereux had been involved in a financial dispute with Lord Atwell, it stood to reason that there might have been ill feelings between them. Perhaps the argument was more than just a matter of money. It could have been a matter of pride, jealousy, or even revenge. Poirot's voice broke through my thoughts. "But there is yet another thing, mon ami, a small clue that has been overlooked until now. You remember the piece of jewelry given to Lady Evelyn by Devereux, an intricate necklace, yes? Well, I have learned that this necklace was not just a gift, but something more." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "The necklace, Hastings. It contains a hidden compartment. A small space where, if one is clever enough, something could easily be concealed." I was taken aback by the suggestion. A hidden compartment in a necklace? The idea seemed absurd. And yet, with Poirot's sharp mind, I had learned not to discount even the most unlikely possibilities. "It is the perfect place for a secret, non?" Poirot mused, "and I believe this secret is crucial. If we could find what is hidden within that compartment, it would bring us closer to understanding not just the connection between Lady Evelyn and Devereux, but the motive for Lord Atwell's murder. I could hardly contain my astonishment. "Do you think Lady Evelyn knew about the compartment?" Poirot's gaze was inscrutable as he leaned back in his chair. "Ah, that is the question, Hastings. But one thing is clear. Devereux's visit, the necklace, the letter with the fingerprint, it all leads back to the same point. A deception, a hidden truth that has been carefully masked." I stood, my mind racing. "Poirot, if we can find what's inside that necklace, it could unravel everything." Poirot nodded, but his expression was far from triumphant. "Perhaps, but Hastings, we must tread carefully. The web is vast, and we are but small insects caught within it. Lady Evelyn is more than just a grieving widow. There are depths to her actions that we have not yet fathomed. And Charles—" His voice trailed off, but I could sense the underlying doubt in his words. "Charles," I repeated, momentarily thrown off track by the mention of the son. "You think he might be involved?" Poirot's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Charles's debts, his volatile temper. We cannot ignore the possibility that he too has a role to play in this tragic affair." I shook my head, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle over me. "But Poirot, if Devereux had this motive, the affair, the financial dispute with Lord Atwell, could that not be enough to drive him to murder?" Poirot smiled again, though this time it was tinged with something darker. "It could, Hastings, but there is something else I have yet to reveal, something that will shift everything you think you know about this case, and it all hinges on one final piece of the puzzle." I felt a chill run through me as I followed Poirot's gaze to the desk where the letter and the necklace now sat. Silent, inscrutable. There was no mistaking the significance of those objects. In one way or another, they held the key to everything. "But what, Poirot?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" Poirot stood, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. "Patience, mon ami. The time will come when all will be revealed. But for now we must turn our attention to the necklace. It is the link, the critical clue, and I have a feeling that once we unravel its mystery, the entire case will begin to fall into place." I nodded, though a sense of unease settled in my chest. Poirot's certainty was both comforting and unsettling. The pieces were indeed falling into place, but the final picture was one I was not yet ready to see. As I left Poirot's study, my mind was racing. I had no idea what the next day would bring, but I could sense that we were on the brink of something much larger than I had ever anticipated. The hidden compartment, the mysterious man, the artist, and the necklace, it all felt like a carefully constructed tale, each piece leading us closer to the truth. And when that truth came to light, I knew it would change everything. The tension in the Atwell household had reached a breaking point. With every passing day, the pressure mounted, yet no one seemed to be cracking. Poirot, however, was growing ever more focused, his sharp eyes missing no detail, his mind connecting pieces that I had not even begun to notice. Still, as much as I trusted his judgment, the atmosphere in the house was beginning to gnaw at my own patience. There were days when I felt the weight of the walls closing in on me, as if the secrets of the Atwell family had seeped into every crack, every corner. Then, on a damp morning that seemed to set the perfect mood for what was to come, Charles disappeared. It was not the kind of vanishing one might expect from a man on the run. No dramatic exit, no flurry of excitement. Charles simply was not in his room when it was time for his morning interview with Poirot. His personal effects were untouched, no note was left behind, and the servants were utterly baffled. He was simply gone. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere immediately. Even Poirot's composure wavered as he digested the news, his brow furrowed, but there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. He was already thinking 2 steps ahead, his mind racing with possible motives and outcomes. "Mon ami," Poirot said, almost to himself, his voice low and calculating, "it is not so much that Charles has disappeared, but rather why he has disappeared. This disappearance, it is a message, and we must understand it." But what was the message? It seemed so obvious, yet Poirot's calm words suggested there was more to it, something hidden beneath the surface. His mind, as always, worked its gears silently, methodically. He instructed the staff to search the estate, just in case, as he put it. Charles was hiding somewhere, but Poirot himself turned to other matters. I shall see if there are any new clues in the matter of Charles's finances, he mused. There is something about his money troubles that we have not yet uncovered, and I feel this will lead us to the truth of his disappearance. I went with Poirot to Charles's study, where Poirot had already begun rifling through drawers and bookshelves. There, in a locked drawer at the far corner of the room, Poirot found a leather-bound diary, its pages slightly yellowed with age. It was Charles's handwriting, no doubt about it, and as Poirot flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowed with each entry. "Ah," Poirot said softly, his finger tracing a line on the page. "This is most illuminating." The diary revealed something I had not anticipated. Charles had been deeply in debt, far deeper than we had suspected. There were entries detailing desperate attempts to settle old loans, to appease creditors, to borrow money from anyone who might lend it. Yet the most alarming entry was one from just 2 days before his disappearance. It read, "I must resolve. This now, or I will lose everything. My father's death might have been my salvation, but it may also be my undoing. If I am caught, if I am found, I shall lose it all." Poirot closed the diary with a resigned sigh. "You see, Hastings, it was not the disappearance alone that is troubling. It is this sense of a man on the brink. It would seem Charles was not just escaping the law, he was running from something more personal." I felt a chill at the words. The phrase, "my father's death might have been my salvation," resonated deeply. Had Charles been so desperate that he saw his father's death as the opportunity to resolve his troubles, to erase his financial ruin? It painted a different picture of Charles, one of a man with far more to lose than I had initially thought. Before Poirot could make further sense of the diary, however, a new shock struck the estate, a discovery that would send the investigation spiraling into deeper confusion. Alice, the young maid, was found dead in a locked room. The circumstances were as grim as they were puzzling. Alice's body was discovered in a small storeroom on the 2nd floor, a single window bolted shut, the door locked from the inside. At first glance, it appeared to be a suicide. Alice had a length of rope around her neck, and there were no signs of a struggle. The room was eerily still, the only sound the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I felt my breath catch as I surveyed the scene, the unease growing like a knot in my stomach. It was as if the walls of this house were closing in on us, trapping us in a maze of lies and half-truths. Poirot's eyes swept over the room, his mind ticking through possibilities faster than I could follow. "A suicide, Hastings?" I asked, unable to hide the skepticism in my voice. "It hardly seems likely." Poirot did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on Alice's lifeless form. "No," he murmured, almost to himself. "This is no suicide. It is a carefully orchestrated misdirection." I could feel my heart race at his words. "What do you mean? Are you suggesting that Alice was murdered?" Poirot's expression remained calm, though I could see a flicker of something beneath his composed exterior, a crack in the facade of patience. "Yes, Hastings, but it is more than that. This is a message. Someone is trying to mislead us, to throw us off the scent. The question is why?" The investigation was no longer just about uncovering the truth of Lord Atwell's death. It had become a maze, a twisted game in which each move seemed to take us further from the answer. Poirot's earlier calm demeanor was now tinged with frustration, though he remained as methodical as ever, piecing together the facts with precision. Alice, who we thought was an innocent bystander, is now a part of the puzzle. She knew something important. Perhaps it was the same secret Charles was trying to bury. I could feel the tension rising, the walls closing in once more. We were no longer dealing with isolated incidents or family secrets. Now, it seemed as though we were being manipulated, our every step guided by unseen hands. Poirot paused, his eyes flicking back to me. "Hastings," he said slowly, "there is someone who is playing a very dangerous game. And that person is now drawing closer to making a mistake." I didn't fully understand Poirot's meaning, but I felt it in my bones. We were on the verge of something. The truth was closer than ever before, but it was also more elusive, more treacherous. And with each new development, the danger of this game grew more apparent. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the thought that we were being misled, that every step we took was being watched, guided, orchestrated, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The pieces were nearly in place. But as Poirot had so often reminded me, the hardest part was yet to come. The moment when the true face of the killer would finally be revealed. The drawing room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The last few days had been a blur of investigation, misdirection, and false conclusions. But now, finally, the end was in sight. Poirot stood before us, calm as ever, his eyes scanning the faces of the remaining suspects, Lady Evelyn, Charles, Alice's parents, and the rest of the staff who had remained after the shocking events that had unfolded. In the far corner, Mr. Blanchard, the butler, stood with his hands folded behind his back, his usual impassive expression betraying nothing of the turmoil that had gripped the house in recent days. I had suspected many things, but nothing prepared me for what Poirot was about to reveal. Poirot's voice cut through the tension. "Mes amis, we have reached the conclusion of this most puzzling case, but before I unveil the solution, I ask that you pay close attention. For as always, it is not the obvious that holds the truth, but the smallest detail, one that eludes the eye of the ordinary observer." There was a soft rustling as the family shifted in their seats, and Poirot's gaze drifted over each face, before settling on the butler. "I must admit," Poirot continued, "that throughout this investigation I have often found myself distracted. By the emotions of Lady Evelyn, by the desperation of Charles, by the tragic death of Alice, each of these events seemed to steer me down a different path. But now, with the facts laid bare before me, I see where my thoughts had gone astray. I exchanged a glance with Hastings, feeling a mix of confusion and dread. Poirot had been so confident in his conclusions, yet now he was suggesting something I could hardly believe. What had we missed? Poirot spoke again, his voice low but firm. It was not Charles, nor Lady Evelyn, nor even Alice who was the true culprit. The person who orchestrated Lord Atwell's death, who manipulated every piece of this puzzle, was none other than Mr. Blanchard, the butler. There was a collective gasp from the room, but Poirot's calm demeanor never faltered. He continued, his voice steady, but with a note of finality that sent a shiver down my spine. "Yes, Mr. Blanchard, the seemingly mild-mannered servant who had been with the Atwell family for years, the one who moved silently in the background, ensuring the smooth running of the estate. But underneath that mask of loyalty, he was a man driven by greed and a thirst for power." The room was still as death as Poirot paused, letting the words sink in. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Blanchard, the unassuming butler who had always been the very picture of propriety. It didn't make sense. But Poirot's eyes were unwavering as he continued his unraveling of the mystery. The murder of Lord Atwell was not just a crime of passion or an act of desperation. It was part of a carefully planned scheme. Mr. Blanchard had been embezzling funds from the family, for years skimming off the top with no one the wiser. But when Lord Atwell began to suspect the theft, he became a threat. Blanchard knew that if he was discovered, everything would come crashing down. Poirot's gaze moved to the fireplace, where a piece of paper lay carefully arranged. A letter that had once been thought to have been penned by Charles. The letter, the fingerprint we found, these were all part of the carefully constructed misdirection. Blanchard planted those clues to divert suspicion. He was trying to throw us off, to make us look in the wrong direction. I felt my stomach lurch as the pieces fell into place, but Poirot was not done yet. He turned back to face us, his expression one of quiet triumph. "But the key to understanding the truth lies not just in the murder, but in a small, overlooked detail, the death of Alice. We all assumed it was a tragic suicide, but it was in fact another part of Blanchard's plan. He knew that Charles had been found wanting, that Alice had been his confidant. The only person who might have known the full extent of his financial troubles, By killing her, he removed the final piece that could have exposed him. Lady Evelyn, who had been silent throughout, now spoke, her voice trembling with disbelief. "But why, Mr. Blanchard? Why would you do all of this? You've been with us for so long, we trusted you." Blanchard's face remained impassive, his eyes betraying nothing of the storm inside him. Finally he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Trust? Loyalty? These words mean nothing to a man who has nothing left to lose. I have given everything to this family, and for what? I was overlooked, dismissed, while others squandered wealth that should have been mine. Lord Atwell never appreciated me, and his death gave me the chance to take control of everything he had. It was then that Poirot made his final revelation, the last twist in the tale. And let us not forget, mon ami, the small but crucial clue that confirmed my suspicions, the piece of jewelry given to Lady Evelyn by the artist. It was no gift of affection, no token of love, but a subtle message, a way for Blanchard to cover his tracks. That jewelry had been carefully planted in the room of the deceased. It was no accident that it was found near Alice's body. Blanchard's expression faltered for a moment, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, but he quickly regained his composure. "And so, mes amis," Poirot concluded, his voice now tinged with a note of finality, "the truth is revealed. It was Blanchard, the ever-loyal butler who has been pulling the strings behind the scenes. His motive was greed, pure and simple. He manipulated every one of you, using your emotions, your fears to cover his tracks. And now he stands here, caught by the very thing that he thought would save him, his own ambition." There was silence. In the room, the weight of Poirot's words hanging heavily in the air. Blanchard's calm mask had finally cracked, but he did not resist. The truth had been exposed, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. As the police took him away, I looked at Poirot, a deep sense of awe filling me. It was in moments like these, when the last pieces of the puzzle fell into place, that I was reminded of the brilliance of my friend. Poirot's mind, with its endless labyrinth of logic and deduction, had seen what none of us had. He had unraveled the threads, pulling each one taut until the final knot was undone. "We are all the victims of our own emotions, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, as if to himself. "But it is the calmness of reason, of logic, that brings the truth to light. And with that, the case was closed. The killer was unmasked, the mystery solved, and the Atwell estate at last could begin to heal from the wounds it had endured." The days following Blanchard's arrest were a strange, almost surreal blur. The press had descended upon the Atwell estate in droves, eager to report the shocking scandal that had erupted within one of the country's oldest and most respected families. Lady Evelyn's name was dragged through the mud, and her past, a complicated affair with the artist, the mysterious man whose identity had been concealed, was revealed to the public. It was a betrayal of sorts, though one could hardly fault her for the choices she had made in the face of the long years of loneliness that had defined her marriage to Lord Atwell. Yet the public's condemnation was swift and relentless, and Lady Evelyn seemed to shrink beneath it all. I could not help but feel a deep sympathy for her. In a world so eager to point fingers, where there were few real answers, it was easy to lose sight of the human cost. It was as though her own tragedy, the loss of her husband, had somehow become secondary to the far more salacious stories the press had so eagerly seized upon. Poirot, however, seemed untroubled by the media frenzy. He had done his job, and the truth had emerged clear as daylight. As for the investigation, the justice system would now take its course, and Blanchard would face the consequences of his actions. The logical order had been restored, and Poirot had done what he always did, bring clarity to the confusion that life so often presented. One morning, a few days after the case had been concluded, I found myself walking alongside Poirot through the estate grounds. The estate, which had been a scene of such tension and drama only a week ago, was now eerily quiet. The lush green lawns stretched out before us, dotted with bright spring flowers, the air fresh and crisp. It was as though the world had moved. On, leaving the shadows of the past behind, Poirot walked with his usual deliberate pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on some distant point, though his mind, I knew, was far from idle. I had come to appreciate the way Poirot's thoughts always seemed to turn inward, even when his outward demeanor appeared perfectly still. The world, for him, was never just what it seemed. "I must confess, mon ami," Poirot said, breaking the silence as we walked. "There are times when I wonder not about the case itself, but about the people involved. You see, the most fascinating part of this affair was not the murder itself, but the motives, the psychology of those caught in the web of intrigue." I glanced at Poirot, intrigued. "You mean the way everyone reacted?" "Precisely," Poirot replied, his voice soft but certain. "The true culprit, Mr. Blanchard, had hidden his ambitions so well that no one suspected him. It is always the quiet ones, the ones who blend into the background, who hide their secrets with such mastery. But what is even more telling, mon ami, is how those who are least likely to be guilty, the victims, the suspects, are often the ones who betray the most." I nodded slowly, though I wasn't entirely sure I understood the full meaning of his words. Poirot, as ever, was a master of layers and subtlety. "But the way Alice's death was framed," I said, trying to make sense of the whole affair. "It seemed like part of Blanchard's plan to cover his tracks. He used her to divert suspicion, to make us think it was all connected to the artist." Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Exactly. Alice's death, the manner in which it was staged, it was all part of the manipulation. Blanchard knew the family, knew their weaknesses, but what he did not account for was the one thing that most people overlook: human nature. It was not the physical evidence that led me to the truth, but the behavior, the reactions, the choices made by each person under pressure." I felt a pang of admiration, as I always did when Poirot spoke of his methods. He was so far ahead of the rest of us, seeing things in ways that were invisible to the ordinary eye. "And what about Lady Evelyn?" I asked, glancing toward the mansion where she had retreated after the revelations of the scandal. Poirot hesitated, his eyes darkening for a moment. "She, too, is a victim. A woman who sought love and understanding in a world that demanded something else. The affair, the artist, those were not the real crimes. The real crime was the way the world turned its back on her, judging her without mercy." I could see the sorrow in his expression, and for a moment I wondered if Poirot saw more of the world's injustices than he let on. Perhaps beneath that calm exterior there was more compassion than he let others see. But that, I knew, was something Poirot would never reveal. He was not one to be swept away by emotions. His work, his life, was governed by logic and reason. Yet in the end, I mused, Blanchard will pay for what he has done. There is some comfort in knowing that justice, however imperfect, has been served. Poirot turned to face me, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Justice, mon ami, is a delicate thing. It is not always swift, and it is certainly not always perfect. But in the end, it is the truth that speaks the loudest, and truth, like water, will always find its way to the surface." I chuckled at his words, though I knew he was right. In the end, it was the truth that had illuminated the darkness, unmasking the culprit and revealing the true motives behind the murder. Blanchard had been blinded by his greed, by his desire for power, and in the end it had been his own actions that had brought him down. As we continued our walk, I could not help but reflect on the events of the past few days. The case had been more than just a puzzle to solve. It had been a study of human nature, of the ways in which people deceive, manipulate, and hide their true selves. It had shown me once again how fragile the line between good and evil can be, and how often the truth is obscured by the masks people wear. At last, we reached a small bench beneath a tree, and Poirot paused, lowering himself onto it with a sigh of contentment. He looked up at the sky, his gaze thoughtful, as if taking in the serenity of the moment. "One cannot help but wonder," he said quietly, "how many more secrets lie buried beneath the surface of this world, waiting to be uncovered. But for now at least, justice has been done." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words, and as the sun began to set behind the trees, casting a warm golden light over the estate, I realized that, for all the twists and turns of the investigation, it was the truth that had emerged victorious in the end. "In the end, mon ami," Poirot said with a wry smile, "it is always the truth that speaks the loudest, and with that, The mystery was finally laid to rest.